Hello, welcome you all in Bahujan Scholars online event. And this is how to transform a dissertation into a book series. And our first speaker is Wendy Matsumura. My name is Bharat Rathod. I am the Assistant Director of Inclusion and Engagement at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I'm the founder of Bahujan Scholar, this initiative. Bahujan Scholar is a network of graduate students, faculty, and professionals from outside India. And the goal of the network is to support scholars from Bahujan communities, build networks, mentoring group and one-on-one mentoring, promote Anticast research and activism, and organize online events on academic and professional development issues. Um, we are so excited to announce that our first one-on-one mentoring project will start from February, and soon we will announce the second one-on-one mentoring program in March or April. If you are interested to be a mentor, please send us your interest or query at bahujanscholars.org@gmail.com. I would post the email in the chat box. So I would hand over this session to my friend and one of the member of the Bahujan Scholar Network, Sahista Patel. So Sahista will moderate this session. So Sahista, please take it over.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bharat. Everyone, welcome. My name is Shaista Patel, and I am Assistant Professor of Muslim Studies at University of California, San Diego, from where Professor Wendy Matsumura is joining us. And one thing I want to say about Professor Matsumura is that she's very humble and shy. So I just want to embarrass her more by reading her bio, which again is a truncated one, because I mean, she's done so much work that it's just impossible to capture it in just one intro. But Professor Matsumura is associate, and we can all clap, soon to be full professor in history at UC San Diego. Dr. Matsumura received her PhD in history from New York University in 2007. Her dissertation project on modern Okinawan history was funded by a Fulbright dissertation fellowship from 2002 to 2004. The completion of her first book, The Limits of Okinawa, which came from Duke University Press in 2015, and research for her next project, which released last year, were supported by another Fulbright Research Fellowship. Her 2024 book, Waiting for the Cool Moon, Anti-Imperialist Struggles in the Heart of Japan's Empire, interrogates the erasure of colonial violence at the heart of Japanese nation-state formation. Professor Matsumura, as an Okinawan feminist scholar herself, critiques Japan studies' role in the effacement and contends that the fields must engage with anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity as the grounds on which to understand imperialism, colonialism, fascism, and other forces that shape national consciousness. And I also want to say that, she's the kind of ally in anti-caste and anti-Islamophobia work that makes a huge difference for our work as caste oppressed and or Muslim folks. So please help me welcome Professor Wendy Matsumura. Wendy, the floor is yours. I'm going to mute myself.
All right. Thank you so much, Shaista and Bharat. Can you, is my voice okay? People always tell me to like speak up, and it's like a little bit annoying, but I totally understand why they say it. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I am here. I understand this is like part one of a multi-part series. And so my understanding is that I'm really sort of here to talk about the sort of beginning process, questions about like what sort of things you should be thinking about as you're, kind of like writing your dissertation or thinking about how to write your dissertation as it pertains to the question of writing a book. And so you can sort of ask me anything, but that's sort of like those are the parameters within which I've tried to think about what to talk about today. So I guess a couple of things. One thing is that if there are any questions that come up while I'm talking, you can, raise your hand, but you can also put your questions in the chat so you don't forget your question, and then we'll have a pretty long Q&A, sort of time for Q&A at the end. So yeah, I'll just start about sort of this question of like pre-book proposal considerations. So I think, when I was in graduate school and I was writing my dissertation, I really hadn't thought about kind of questions around the book. I just sort of assumed that my job was to one day turn my dissertation into a book. And this was like a long time ago. So this was what, like 17 years ago. And at that time, my advisors never really told me anything except that you have to have a book, or like that was the sort of like goal. I think things are pretty different, dramatically different now. And so what scholars, younger scholars now have to do is to really sort of think about, okay, there is a dissertation project, but there are also things that need to be published or in process of being published along the way. And so I think one of the things that is really important to think through is, okay, like what are you going to, what's sort of like the long-term goal in terms of a book manuscript, a monograph that you want to publish, and then what are some pieces of your research project that you might want to publish as shorter pieces or articles in advance. And so that's something to think about, and that's something that has to be balanced with the kind of reality that publishers are not necessarily going to be interested in your book proposal if you've already published everything in other places. And so that is really something to kind of keep in mind. So for folks who are actively working on the dissertation, the question of what to publish and what to say is sort of one that you're going to have to navigate. And that, of course, is related to the question of time, right? Because anytime you sort of break something off and decide that you're going to try to publish it as sort of a separate article, there is a lot of reframing and work that you're going to have to do that. So there is sort of a really important question of time and capacity that you also have to think through. Another thing that you might want to think about, which wasn't a concern for me at all, but is sort of a question for scholars coming up now, is the sort of question of how much you want your work to be public facing. Um, what does that mean, right? That actually can mean a lot of different things. Um, but sort of this question of, as a scholar, how much you want your work to be read by an audience that is not an audience that is sort of within your narrow area of specialization, right? That can include other academics, right? But it can also sort of, and probably should include considerations of just sort of a broader non-academia kind of audience. To give you an example, um, you know, I think if we take like my first book, for example, right? It was probably read pretty seriously by like 20 people, if we're being honest. And that's because it was a narrow book, right? It was a book that really tried to intervene in existing debates around how to think about pre-World War II Okinawan history. Even though I claim to want to sort of address the discipline as a whole, the reality is that, there's sort of a very small group of people that are going to be able to, that have the expertise to address the quality of the work, right? And then there are other people who are like in a broader sort of field called Japan Studies, which is where I was trained, where people wouldn't necessarily have the knowledge of, how I'm reading the documents or how I'm sort of like intervening in this particular debate, who are still going to sort of generally be interested in evaluating the work through like book reviews or by deciding whether or not they want to teach the book in their classes, right? Or how much it's going to then inform the way that they teach the topic of Okinawa. So that's like, a little bit bigger group. So in terms of public facing scholarship, I would say that that sort of goes beyond those sort of two groups of people and would be sort of like thinking about, okay, so what about those broader questions and interventions that I think I'm making around, the relationship between history and theory, for example, right? And that sort of going to require a way of framing, right? That is going to be a slightly different from the way that I'm talking to sort of my sort of like 10 to 20 peers that I know are going to be like hyper focused on my work. And so you have, kind of, and there are sort of outlets that you can consider, right? Writing in. Those could be academic spaces, right? But so yeah, that you're going to have to sort of like do a little bit of like revising in terms of your language. You probably need to do a little bit more like introducing things step by step in those spaces. And then there's sort of the broader, for me, right? The question of, well, do I want to really speak to people who I sort of think about as being part of my community? That I want to sort of say something slightly different to than simply sort of like, presenting my research. That sort of, kind of um, a tougher or like more challenging prospect, especially if you're not used to that kind of writing, because it is going to require that you recognize when certain sort of phrasings or certain sort of concepts are not really as widely understood as you might sort of assume. And it's going to sort of require sort of you to maybe get rid of a bunch of those footnotes, right, that you thought were like so important to the academic work. So I'll say that, yeah, there is like, as sort of somebody who's at the dissertation stage, whose goal is still sort of like a book, you still have multiple audiences that you can address, and you can do so in a way that isn't going to, right, just sort of like share out everything, that, and where there's some things you want to sort of keep. Um, any questions up to here? In terms of the question
Oh,
of, is
Wendy,
there a
sorry.
question? Sorry, I can't see.
No, no, no. It's just me, Wendy. I was just wondering, can you also talk about how significant, especially in this moment, public-facing scholarship is, and why, especially I think those of us who are not very legible in the academy, such as Dalits, caste-oppressed Muslims, certain kinds of Pakistanis, Okinawans, that we need to take up, that space and how to make an intervention in that public-facing scholarship or discourses that circulate. Any examples you can give, I think, will be really useful.
Hold on. Yeah, I mean, you could probably speak to this too, but I really think that like there's sort of a question of I don't know, like time and timeliness that comes up, especially when you are somebody, right, who is sort of an expert in things, right, that goes beyond kind of like a common sense understanding of a particular issue that, it can be sort of like repeated over and over as talking points by anybody, right? You have something to offer. I think one of the challenges with, like trying to sort of communicate that sort of expertise that you think is really an important intervention in addressing, right? Like issues that are matters of life and death to people today. I think there are multiple barriers. So one is the sort of time frame. Like Shaisa, you know this, right? Like in order to get an article published, like how many months does it take? You know, I mean, there is that reality where, you know, it could take over a year, right, to get something that you think that was written in a moment of urgency, right, to publication, right? And that's not something that we always want to accept. Um, in terms of, and this gets a little bit sort of into sort of issues that I wanted to talk about later, but in addition to sort of the question of time, right, there is also this question, this issue that not all of us are on like level playing fields when it comes to this question of publications, right? So I said sometimes it could take, you know, like something to see the light of day in terms of like going through a proper publication process, even if it's just an article and not like a book, right? Like it could take a year and a half, right? That's not true for everybody. I mean, if we're being honest, right? There are people who have access to publications because they are on editorial boards or because they have friends who are on editorial boards, you know, that are going to get their things through much, much more quickly. We can't be sort of like unaware of that, right? And so it's not that like people are publishing things quickly and in great volume because they're better scholars. It's because they have access to all these networks, right? And so when you're dealing with that kind of uneven um, playing field, sometimes what can happen is as you're waiting for your work to get published, other people, right, who are in more structurally privileged positions than you might, right, be able to publish things much, much more quickly that are on topics that actually you have more expertise about. So that's a reality, right? And so because of that, sometimes it can be good to think in parallel tracks, right? Where you're not just kind of like waiting for this thing to happen, where you can sort of cultivate these other sort of avenues, right? Where you can get your work out more quickly, um, especially things that you think are urgent. The second issue is really about access. So paywalls exist, right? In academic journals, not everything is going to be open access, or you're going to have to pay thousands of dollars to get something to become open access. And, you know, who has that kind of money, right? And so because of that, you know, you might sort of consider, right, sort of like other things. Um, they can be like online publications. Some journals have associated blogs, right, that are going to be sort of not paywalled. And so you might consider, yeah, like doing things sort of parallel to each other. Are there things I'm missing, Shaista, about sort of the question of public facing work
No, I
and
think
just, yeah, getting things out to the people that you really want to reach, I think should be the rule for just all of the things that we do. It's just that some forms are, yeah, and then like the book, right? The book, like the book is depends on kind of like what discipline you're in. Oh,
we can also take
okay.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at this question. What should our publishers? Okay. Um, we can get to that. Yeah, like let me just say that first of all, for people who are well, I don't know. Do you all think that is the question of like, is the question of what will get you tenure, does that matter to you all? Like, I don't know. Sometimes I talk to my grad students and they're like, academia is dead. We don't even. Anyway, there are sort of like I will say that like when you think about, okay, do I even want to work on a book, right? And sort of a monograph that is based on your dissertation research is specifically what I'm talking about right now. I think what you do is, every position, right? Every job is different. Depends on like what institution you're in and what the sort of standards for promotion generally in your institution are, but more specifically your department, right? It's always going to be like just make sure that you understand whether or not a book is sort of like not having a book, right, is a deal breaker for tenure or for security, right, of employment. And then if it is, then you have to do that, right? If it's not, then you can pursue other sort of forms of publication. It's just that you have to still, though, communicate, right, with the people who are in positions of power within that space. Maybe it's a department chair, right? Or maybe it's sort of a committee on promotion, just to make sure that they understand exactly kind of like what you're doing, right? And that they're not sort of assuming that that your end goal, right, in terms of like that first stage of career is a book, right? It's just important to sort of know what the expectations are and to sort of like communicate with people about sort of like your intent in that regard. Yeah. Um, but I can turn to this question of publishers that's in the chat. So the question is that what sort of publishers should I approach? University publisher versus popular left publisher, if the goal is to get the research to be read widely. And then the ending statement is I want to make the work as open access as possible. And that's a really good question. Um, with this one, you really are going to just have to go through each of the presses. And not even each of the presses, right? But each of kind of like the series and the full catalog of the presses. So I would first recommend, right? You can take a look at your bookshelf, see what books, right? Like where are the books that you find, right, to be like most important being published out of? And then I would just go, you have to just go to them and like take a look. But I will say that, for example, I'm on like the faculty committee that reviews books for University of California Press. I work in the University of California system, and we have UC Press. Um, and in this role, like I'm able to kind of like understand all of the different sort of range of books that they publish. And I do say that they have an academic book sort of like section, which is like the bulk of what University of California Press does, but it also has a couple of other things, right? One is sort of kind of like half academic, half trade kind of publication. Um, and so that would be something like, if you've seen, I don't know, like they're like small, like, American Studies Now series, right? These are like very short books that are not books that are on like original research. They're more like, kind of like, what is militarism, right? Or something like that, right? Written by like somebody who usually has already published sort of their academic book. Um, but is meant, as sort of a handy, like short, non-jargony kind of series that can be used by a larger audience, let's say organizers, or it could be for undergraduate students, or sort of a general public, right? And so they're sort of they have that, and then they have kind of like a full-on, like a trade, what's called a trade sort of series, which is going to be distributed in a completely different way. So academic books, right, for university presses are usually distributed like through libraries. Like libraries will purchase them. Libraries will purchase either hard copies or, you know, ebooks, right? E-versions of this. And that's usually sort of done as a package deal. So there's an agreement usually between the library and the press where the library agrees, right, that they're going to purchase everything published by this press or like these set of presses, right, for the year. And so that's like automatic thing. Um, and then they rely on, sales from academic conferences, right? That's sort of like what they do with the academic books. But when it comes to trade books, that's a completely different route, is what I learned. Which is basically they go through different distributor, right? Which is specialized in getting books into bookstores, like like the big like Barnes and Noble here, right? Or whatever. Um, and so that reaches a completely different audience structurally. And so, yeah, I think like just being sort of, you don't have to be aware of all of this, but just be aware that there are these different routes that sort of presses use to get books to people. And the target audience is like completely different. So we have that. And then we also have like, these radical publishers, right? Like AK Press, PM Press, Verso, yeah, Haymarket, all of these things, right? Um, these presses, yeah, I don't know what to say except that I like them. I'm not as familiar, with sort of like their distribution channels. Um, but I think like those are like perfectly good. Um, yeah, like perfectly good spaces to explore. And then you also have, I mean, the good thing about those presses is that they have sort of very good networks with radical bookstores, right? And so if we think about distribution, those are sort of like the books that are going to be looked at very closely by, radical bookstores in sort of like the various cities that we're talking about, as well as like small kind of like indie bookstores. And so if you are interested in reaching that kind of audience, then it would be good to do that. There any other questions about this part?
Sorry, Wendy, can I just interject and say that for tenure, though you need, most universities need you to publish with a university press. I remember because back when I was a young scholar and going for my first job, one of the questions they asked me is like, what press are you interested in? And being a Canadian and a lefty and whatever, I said, oh, I'm really interested in going with Fernwood, and they all just laughed. And I didn't understand this then, but there are only certain kinds of presses, for example, in ethnic studies where I teach, that are counted as proper books. So that's another thing that you need to figure out. If you publish with AK Press or Warsaw or Haymarket or Fernwood, those might not count for towards your tenure. So that's another thing to keep in mind, even though they circulate a lot more than academic books, which 20 people read, right? Versus like a lot of people reading AK Press.
Yeah, I think there, like it's really like a lot of, snobbery. But it's also that, what tenure files, right, are trying to judge is that you are contributing to the field by doing original, like, academic research, right? And the only way that, they think that that can be checked, right, the quality of that can be checked is through a peer review process, right? A kind of a blind peer review process. And so it's these university presses that are committed, right, to doing that whole process, right? Like getting the external reviewers, doing like multiple rounds of that kind of thing to check, right, your quality and to ensure that you are sort of the expert that you sort of say you are, that you're not sort of, yeah, so that's sort of the distinguishing point, right? In terms of a lot of what counts, right, towards like tenure and promotion at a lot of places. It's whether or not you have the publications that have gone through the peer review process. And so that's the thing, right? If it's just so long as you can make the case, right? And that your publisher can attest to the fact, right? That your work has gone through that peer review process. That's kind of like the most important thing. Um, yeah, it's the safest sort of like route to go if you have reason to be worried, right? About people taking you seriously, because let's face it, um like both of us, right, Shaista and I, like we teach at a school that, is supposedly like a research school. And so, those standards are pretty unwavering, right? You have to do peer review work in order to get promoted, to get tenure, to get promoted again, to get your raises, like all this stuff, right? And to be sort of like recognized as being a scholar. um, that wasn't necessarily the case in my old institution. I taught at a small kind of like middling liberal arts college, where, the school was said they were interested in people who did research, but it was primarily like a teaching institution, which didn't have very clear standards with regards to scholarship and research in terms of tenure. And so there, what happened was, yeah, like it was safe, right? If you like had a peer-reviewed article or two, for most people, but then sometimes those standards would shift when it comes to like racialized folks. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, where's your book? Right. So in any case, yeah, it's like always, safer if you can sort of, kind of um, guard against that kind of arbitrary um, sort of imposition of standards if you do have peer-reviewed publications. Yeah. Any other questions? Presses. Actually, I do want to say something about press. It was called press exploration um, in the on the flyer, I think. But again, in terms of like what presses are good, right? Like for your work, if you're thinking about just kind of like, you know, the book being necessary for your job, um, I would just again look at your shelf first. Um, be aware that there are a lot of presses that are outside of the ones that might usually, right, get cited, that are still sort of good. There are a lot of like publishers that sort of, might not be super well known generally, but publish a lot of good work in your field, right? I would say that's really important, right? Don't sort of like worry about, oh, but University of Nebraska Press, like, I don't know, but nobody really like knows them, right? But they might be sort of the press that has the best books in your field, right? And that's really important um, because it reveals sort of an investment, right, in that field by that press. It probably means that there is a really good editor, right? That's there. And the reason why that's really important is that the editor, right, somebody who is, who understands the field, understands the stakes involved in the research that folks are doing, that are going to be able to find the best external reviewers for your work that are going to not just be assholes, but give you good feedback, that are sort of and an editor that is going to know how to like promote your work. That's more important than just a generically prestigious press for the longevity of your work and for you feeling like, like this isn't just a terrible process that you have to go through. And so I would prioritize finding that editor who gets your work, who is invested in your work over like name of a press. Um, you can make an appointment with editors, right? There are probably two ways or three ways to do this. One way is to get an introduction from somebody you know, right? That's one way to do it. Another way is to just cold email an editor. I hear that editors don't mind this at all. And then the third way is that some editors, if you go to their websites, they have online scheduling. So it's like a Calendly or whatever, right? You can just go and sign up for their office hours. And so these are three ways that you can make an appointment with an editor. Editors have their preferences, but the ones I've spoken to have all said that they do not mind talking to somebody at an early stage because the good editors are interested in building relationships and not just about like, oh, send me everything that you have and let me judge it, right? And so I would encourage you to do that. Um, I wouldn't stress too much about what that email says, right? Because that can be sort of an impediment, right? We could sort of like sit for like weeks with an email that we're afraid to send because we are afraid that, oh my gosh, this is like the first contact. I don't want to mess it up. Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that. Just, if you do sort of have a worry, like let somebody look at it, a friend look at it and just send it off. Um, I think a lot of, what can happen, at least for me, is that it's just that fear, that kind of like holds you back in a lot of these processes. And I totally get it, but um, it's just practice. Like, I think with academia, it's really just sometimes you just have to um, have to just write that email. And don't worry, don't take it personally if people are like, I'm sorry, or don't respond. Because some will, right? That's the thing. Um, yeah, one last thing that I probably should have said earlier is that it's about sort of like where books are published, but sometimes if you look at the book, it'll say like series, right? Like what series they're a part of. And that is also a good thing to keep in mind, right? Like some presses have very prominent book series um, that are heavily curated by the editors of those series. And so you could consider that. But again, like even with those, right? Those are going to be, like a lot of those series. Um, I don't know. There's just a lot of like it's like who you know, right? Like so the book series editors will, kind of funnel like their students or friends of, or students' friends sort of like work into the series. And so sometimes it's like some of the times like the reason why a lot of these like books feel the same is because it's like the same like five, six people having the same conversation over and over again, and reproducing sort of like those networks. You can try, right? If you have like zero connection to those editors, you can try and like still submit your work there. But also like presses are okay with publishing books, that sort of could be in a series, just without a series too. So I would sort of say just keep asking, kind of like questions if you're really interested in a particular, press. But also don't get too caught up in a press. Okay. Um, yeah. Okay. I see the question about the book proposal, and I see that there is another session about that, right? Yeah. Um, and yeah, there's samples, so that's good. Like I can give you my samples too. That's useful. It's pretty formulaic, the book proposal. No need for a lot of creativity there.
Wendy,
Um,
Wendy,
yeah, other
can I
questions?
also, sorry, I just want to say one thing, especially for, those of us who are caste oppressed and Dalit. One of the things that's really important, and both yours and mine, Wendy, our context is only the US because that's basically all we know. But so in the context of the US or Canada, there are presses that have now started to publish books on caste. But an interesting, or rather, I should say, expected thing is that it's usually Brahmin scholars who are writing about caste. For one Shailaja Paik to emerge, there are 100 amazing Dalit scholars whose work never gets to the forefront. And so please keep that in mind if you are looking at a press and you see that, oh, they are publishing on caste and this must be amazing. Look at who's publishing on caste. You would 90% of the time you'll find Tamil or Bengali Brahmins who've written about caste in really terrible ways. But that's what circulates. And so, sometimes going with a press, making space for yourself as well as for others who are caste oppressed and who write about caste, because our lives are about it. That's really, really important. So do not be duped by presses like Duke University Press, which is an extremely casteist press. Something to keep in mind. And ask us, send me an email, send Wendy an email. We'll be happy to talk to you.
I mean, maybe this then, because I forgot to mention the different sort of types of books, right? So we forgot to talk about like edited volumes. I mean, if we're thinking about sort of like ways that you want to be able to build, right? Sort of like and sort of like create space for each other within sort of a particular area. So for me as well, right? Like with, they're like I'm feeling, right? Like this responsibility now to kind of like really provide space for younger Okinawan scholars um, whose work is, I mean, it's there isn't a lot of work in Okinawa in general, like in academia, but then a lot of that work is done by like American scholars or like white scholars whose relationship to Okinawa is, that their parents used to like work in intelligence on Okinawa or people who were in the Marines, right? Like that sort of thing. And there's like a sort of a small but sort of growing number of folks who, are not interested in that, or who sort of like want to write for their community, right? And so one way that you could do that right, is to put together sort of an edited volume. I'm not really like I haven't done that before, Shaista, so I don't really know, what that takes, but I do know it's a lot of work. It's kind of a labor of love. It isn't going to be as sort of like evaluated, right, sort of highly within this very individualized academic space than like a single author like monograph kind of thing. But it is sort of becoming more sort of recognized and accepted, right, as very, very important, the important work of curation and field building. Um, and so that's another sort of option in terms of edited volumes and getting that published. It's going to take a little bit longer, right? Because you're having to deal with like 10, 12 people, schedules and, like, I don't know. And it's also probably going to take a little bit more time in terms of finding like readers, right? So for the press to find readers for that kind of work, because that's a lot of work for the readers, the evaluators who are going to have to go through like not just one argument, right, but multiple arguments and sort of like varying probably, right, sort of quality of work. But um, I don't know, Shaista, are there ways that like you can sort of like help presses or convince presses, that this is important? Did you have any issues with that, or was it like, please give us your work?
For us, it
Yeah.
was, well, because we have an edited book where Shika is one of the contributors. We have 20 chapters. It's a pretty big book. One of the, I mean, I think this is a separate sort of thing, how to get an edited book out. But ours was highly, solicited, so we didn't have that issue. But of course, we still had to send in a book proposal. We still had to make connections. We still had to say, look, our book is making connections between caste and coloniality, and that is so integral, both in South Asia, but also in the context of North America. And so I think, one of the things that I found is that, we had to get into these discourses that circulate, right? Like, so this idea of settler of color, it's a very sort of, circulated concept in North America. And so what does that mean for a settler of color to be Dalit, for example? So it was like the basic, which is a very basic kind of work for those of us who've been working in Anticast studies for like 2 decades. But it's like charting new ground, so to say, bringing Dalit scholars in. We held workshop, and I know Shikha, your work came in a little bit later, but we held two different workshops where people were introduced to each other. Kashmiris led work of other Indigenous scholars in the context of Canada, for example. So I think it created, and out of that, we heard that there are other sorts of books and collaborations that are coming out, and that was amazing, right? So really, for those of us who do anti-caste work, those of us who do identify as Dalit, those of us who are so marginalized, like this is the kind of work that we have to do. And maybe my generation has to do more of that work, and afterwards, people can come in, other junior young Dalit scholars can come in and claim that space. But it's a lot of work that is not counted as much as a terribly written, you know, book. And we know so many scholars steal from graduate students, and yet their books circulate, which is really unfortunate. There's such a the space for ethical writing in academia is shrinking day by day, is what I feel. Yeah, that was my spiel. But
Yeah, I don't really have, too much more to say on my end. I would like, yeah, if you have any questions, if folks have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Taita, may I? Yeah. Yeah. So, Wendy, what you said, and Saista, what you mentioned about the book publication and how Sravana and other people, those who are writing for caste and most of the time is terrible and not properly depicted and presented the issues and the problems and so on. So Bahujan Scholar Group, we have also launched Anticast book project series, and we have one of the editor here in participant. So I would request Gaurav, please, could you please talk about a little bit about our Anticast book series project? Please, Gaurav.
Hello, Javim, everyone, and thank you, Bharat. And no, it was so lovely to hear Wendy and Shaista. Thank you. You have said a lot of things. I mean, I don't need to add anything, but thank you for this intervention, Bharat. So I think Shaista, you mentioned this cost and go to the uh, to the publication, which is very important, and we often don't talk about it. So recently, I remember last year I was talking to there is this uh, committee in UK called COPE, COPE, is called Committee on Publication Ethics. And so there I raised this issue where we they invited almost all the publisher from university presses to all other these business presses. And I raised this issue because I think being in academia for some time and being a reviewer of so many caste related journals or writings, I noticed a trend that most of our first generation scholars from Dalit community, because they are first generation and there are a lot of struggles, struggling with the cultural capital, so the writing and everything. All these things actually it reflects on their paper, and they barely get a chance to get published in the well-known recognized journals. So, and I have seen, like as you said, like with Duke University Press and all, there's so many of journals that we say that the minute it actually goes to the reviewer, and as you know that Dalits Bahujan, they are not much there in the academia. So generally the article goes for review to the upper caste, and the minute they see words like Bahujan and all these, and it immediately get rejected. So so out of that experience, I was proposing, I said, every now and then, uh, these journals should actually also bring some special issue for the first generation learners. So that's one way to do things, because otherwise, how long will I said this is an epistemic injustice. I mean, you keep actually basically reproducing those who are already privileged and privileged with writings, privileged with class and all those backgrounds. So but then, at journal level, it takes it's a very long process and all. And how many journal will do that? That's another. So that's why I think when Bloomsbury approached us, we proposed this. We gave a proposal of publishing the fresh PhD thesis to book, and I think they agreed to it. And so we had to negotiate on many things about even the review process of that who would review and all. So in that sense, more work for us now. Like we are fully loaded, but I think that's one way to help the younger generation, because now, especially what we have seen, the growing trend of private universities in India, where they for sure ask for a international publication, especially books, and it gives you easy way to get in academia. So that's the project that actually we're working on, and so we are always running short of the people who can help. Like it's me, Bharat, there is our main person is Roja Singh, who is another professor, but there are very few. So we're always looking for people who can help our first generation students, and especially the fresh PhD, despite even the generations, the fresh PhD who wants to publish their thesis into a book. So that's how I think we are approaching to a way to help our students.
I think this conversation might also link up with what Shaista put in the chat about embargo, and just generally sort of issues in academia. Well, actually, I don't know if this is what you meant, Shaista, but when I was in graduate school, we didn't really have this embargo thing. And so I'm just thinking about this in terms of conversations that I've had with my students. But it seems like embargoing your dissertation is kind of like a rule these days, or like you just kind of do it. And I think the embargo is 3 years, right? Is the embargo? Oh, it's 4 years. Okay. Um, but I think this sort of like issue of embargoing your work is related to just a broader question or sort of like issues of kind of like theft in the academy. And so I think, and I was thinking about this even in terms of like when folks submit their articles or book proposals or fellowship proposals, to sort of committees. One of the things that I think, I don't know, I feel like everything I say is like negative. But sometimes, right? Those very sort of manuscripts or fellowship applications that are rejected, you see those ideas sort of coming out in people's work, right? And you're like, how did that happen, right? And so I guess I would say, like, there's no way, to really sort of protect yourself against that because of, right, like the structural kind of dominance of certain people within academia, right? Like who's the people, the same people who are making decisions about fellowship applications, who gets that Fulbright, who gets that whatever, right, are going to be the same people who are on the editorial boards, who are reviewing your work, who are then the same people who are going to be sort of like reviewing your tenure and promotion materials. It's just that's what we are dealing with, right? And so I do think that like, these initiatives are so important. Having sort of, people who you trust, who are going to be able to like talk through sort of these questions about like what to share and what to keep, how you're going to sort of balance this desire to intervene in public sort of spaces with, like needing to really sort of keep some of that to yourself until your work is in sort of a publication process. Like, I think that these are things that we just need to be aware of and that you need to sort of like have people that you can talk about this stuff to because the sort of amount of intellectual dishonesty and like appropriation of work and language and concepts is not small, right? And so the more we can create these sorts of spaces, get people who understand this stuff you know onto kind of like boards and things like that. And, try, if you have the opportunity to, be sort of a series editor or like earn positions where you can recommend somebody, right? Those are things that I think we do have to do. Should I start? Can I say something?
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Just quickly, one thing I want to say is that create witnesses, and a witness could be your supervisor, but sometimes supervisors are hostile. Sometimes supervisors get insecure because their students are smarter than them. It happens, right? Because we get old and tired and read less and less as we progress in terms of like job protection. But I think creating a witness who knows that, okay, this is your work is really, really important. And I say this as somebody who's been injured many times, and I wish I had a witness who could have fought on my behalf when I finished my PhD like 10 years ago. So that's very important. And the other thing I just quickly want to mention is that, Wendy, one of the things that you mentioned that's really important is from a dissertation, how much can be published. Often, when you are writing your dissertation, you have to have a method section, methodology, theoretical framework. Those are not necessarily the things that go into the book. And so those are the things, that's the stuff that you've written, like, maybe 50, 60 pages that can actually be edited down into an article. So that's another good idea for, how to protect your dissertation if you want to make it into a book eventually while you're working on it. And but you take the methodology method. My dissertation was contrapuntal. I mean, I didn't publish anything from that because I'm just lazy. But if you're motivated, that's a really good way of publishing from your dissertation, because that part doesn't go into the book in the way that your supervisor makes you write your dissertation, so that they know that you know how to do this. So most books, Wendy, I don't know if you know the stats for like the presses you've worked with, but I was told that only 10% of the dissertation can be published as journal articles if you want to make your dissertation into a book. So keep that in mind. There are also some presses that do publish everything that you've written as journal articles, and they publish it in a book. And so that's really important. That this press that you want to work with does publish stuff that has been published, or this press is really, really strict. It only publishes 10% of what you've already published. So those are some of the important things to keep in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, on that, I think it also, yeah, it depends on the press, right? So you really should check, but you definitely don't want to be publishing like all of your research chapters um, ahead of time, right? Because yeah, the presses aren't going to want that necessarily. I was also thinking though, in terms of this question of like how much of what to publish, and it has to do with kind of tenure standards, but in the US. So I just want to sort of like qualify that. One of the things that sort of US based institutions care about is like kind of how much work you've done between the dissertation and the book, right? And so they're not going to really sort of like react favorably if you say, okay, here's my dissertation. Here are 3 articles that I published based on my dissertation work. And then here is my book that is basically just a collection of like 4 chapters, including the 3 that I've already published as my promotion, as my tenure book, right? So that's sort of another thing. Even if the press is okay with it, you also need to think about like your institution or an institution's um, tenure and promotion standards, right? A lot of them are going to want to see the way that you have developed as a scholar within those 6 or 7 years, or I don't know, for me it was like 8 years between your PhD, the granting of your PhD, and the time where your tenure file is being evaluated. And so, it's better if, you can sort of like think of ways where, you said, oh, okay, like here's my dissertation, but here's the way, right? That sort of my thinking and my framing things has changed significantly between that time and right now. And here are the publications, or here are the things that reflect that development in my thinking in my publications, right? And so that's just a sort of a thing to consider. Yeah, they really want to see that. They just kind of want it. It's always about like, development as a scholar and like where you're going next, right? And so this is sort of outside of the actual like transformation of dissertation to book, but really important for you to consider. Um, yeah. Any other questions?
May I? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Wendy, I mean, this is my own experience I'm sharing here, and probably helpful to the participants, to learn from and your insights about this. So, I finished my dissertation, and I was so motivated, so focused. So, in after my finishing my dissertation, in like 7, 8 months, I finished my book, right? And now I finished my book, and now I'm looking back and I'm thinking that what should have been the right approach in terms of, instead of focusing on book or focusing on chapter, I mean, articles from that, What should have been the right approach? Honestly, I don't have answer on this point of time, and still I'm trying to, kind of juggling with that kind of a scenario. So if you share your opinion or insight, like what should be the right approach and how that might impact your career prospect and so on, or different scenario, if you can explain about that. Thank you.
That's so impressive. I think 7, 8 years late, 8 months after, I was like fooling around doing nothing. Um, yeah, I really don't, I really can't say, I think everybody, it's sort of like different for everybody, different for your department, like what discipline you're in, all of these things. I don't think there's like a single, like right way to do anything. What I will say is that, kind of like moving forward, right? I would say that like whenever it is that you feel like you are ready um to to present your work like in sort of a book form, I think the most important thing is to really sort of like Um, not take rejection personally. I know it's a very weird, like it's just like not a really helpful thing to say, but that's sort of like what I want to say. Which is that, you kind of never know, right? Like what's going to happen in terms of like, yeah, you don't know, right? Like how folks are going to react to that proposal. You won't know until you try and submit it. There is a question of like, where do you want to try first, right? Um, which is sort of this whole like, then submitting is a whole nother workshop, right? Like, where do you submit? How many do you submit to? Like all those questions. But I think it's sort of like as I think if you should be clear, right, though, about like what the book is for, like what kind of institution you're in. Are there sort of future things you're thinking about? Is the place you're in not the place you want to be, right? If so, then how does sort of like that book fit into sort of this question about being able to move, right, to the kind of place you want to be? I think that these are very context specific discussions that you need to have. But just, yeah, being clear that like a book might not necessarily, like a single authored monograph might not necessarily be where you end up feeling like you want to spend all of your time and energy. Um, or, right, you might think, okay, like this is the thing I have to do right now, right? And just being sort of like aware of that and being aware of like what it's for. Is it for tenure? Right? If it's for tenure and purely for tenure, then, you do certain things, right? If it's for something else, like if it's not for tenure, but it's sort of, or, I mean, it's all related, right? But if it's really about sort of wanting to make a particular kind of mark, right? And engage and have a particular kind of engagement with sort of a group of people that you care about, then the pace of that is going to look very different. The process, right, through which you sort of decide where you want to publish is going to be very different, right? And so it's just about sort of like spending a little bit of time um, to figure all of that out. I'm sorry it's such a not concrete kind of answer, but it's all so different. Like we all have to figure this stuff out. My
Wendy,
first book was a tenure book. It was a like, I need to get the hell out of South Carolina where I think I'm gonna die. Um, and let me publish this book, right? That was really what it was. The second is a little bit, it is quite different from that. Yeah.
thank you, Wendy. Sorry, I just wanted to say two more things is that, one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is the press that you're going with. How much are the books? How much do they cost? And so, for example, if you go with OUP, their books are what, like 89 dollars, whatever. How many graduate students, for example, or even faculty who have research funds, most of us do, are able to be, are able to afford getting your book, right? We might as well just get a pirated copy, I'm sorry to say, or a library version, whatever, if possible. And so versus those books that are paperback and that cost $25. The chances that people will spend $25 to get your book, and it's not about, the royalties, which are, I don't know, Wendy, if you want to share how much money you got. I know our edited book is gonna get us $1. So it's not about that, but it's also about like, it's also about, sorry, 700 is, I mean, if you write for Al Jazeera a short article, you get $400, okay, for 1,000 word. But again, like, so that's also really important to keep in mind, that press. And the other thing, sorry, just one last thing I want to say is that um, if you are not happy in your job situation, if you want to transfer to somewhere else, the chances of you finding another job are a lot higher if you do not have a book, because a book gets you tenure in your department. And so it's that much harder to find another job once you're tenured as an associate prof, than if you're an assistant prof, because most of the job openings are for assistant prof. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Often people just publish their book and then they're stuck in that department that they absolutely detest. So
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot. If folks want to share their experiences or want to ask any questions, please.
Yeah, last question from my side. Yeah, because I'm taking opportunity because as I said, I've been associated with the mentoring young scholars. So, I mean, Windy or Saista, if you know any resource, online resource in terms of the publication as a whole process and various aspects and approach and method and other kind of relevant information, that would be great to, I mean, learn from that and to think about because as you said, Windy, it's very complex and diverse process, discipline to discipline and approach and research and so many other data and so on. So if you suggest any online resource, that would be a great kind of a resource for participants to learn from and think about. Thank you.
Yes, so I just put one in the chat. And then yeah, the Portwood is also excellent. There are also YouTube videos. If you search YouTube and like university press book proposal or book publication process, there are a few. Yet again, I will say that like mm, all of these are helpful to some extent. They do not address sort of some of the sort of issues that have been brought up today, is what I'll say. But still, right, good as sort of demystifying kind of what things look like. I think one of the things that I do know that I was really like scared about when I was publishing my first book is that there was always this feeling that it was never actually going to happen until I got the book in my hands. Like I just felt like, okay, like at any point, like the editor is going to email me and tell me that like it's off. Like actually we changed our minds, right? That's actually not true. As far as I have heard and as I've seen in the process, like once an editor is interested in your work, and has sort of gone through the effort of reading your proposal, maybe meeting you, maybe sending out your proposal. So there's like a couple of stages, right? They send out your proposal before they send out the full manuscript. Um, is that, they're actually like they've already committed their time. They're actually interested. Sometimes they've spent money out of their budget to try to get somebody to do some preliminary reading. And so I think like once you get to that point, like I think like just do the process. Don't worry so much. because it is like extremely like the whole PhD all the way I think through I would say getting tenure. That's like a whole like ball of anxiety that people like I was just like not sure of anything the whole time until I got tenure. And so I would just say like it's natural, like, to feel that way. But you can sort of talk to people who can tell you, okay, these are the things you should be stressed about, and these are things that you shouldn't, right? And there was a hand. Priyanshi had a hand, I think. So if you want to ask a question, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So I had two questions actually. One is for Dr. Shaista, and the other one is open to all the panel. The question to Dr. Shaista is: do you mind? Do you mind telling me, or just? I'm sorry. Do you mind going back to the assistant professorship and the tenure track advice that you were giving just a while back? And the second question is, do you have any advice for people who want to go for some different industries, let's say publishing industry as an editor or UX?
Hello, Priyansi, you're done?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Pranchi. And you can also always message me. But what I was saying is that sometimes, okay, so again, this is in the context of the US. I have absolutely no idea how things work in the context of India. But in US and in Canada, those are my two familiar contexts. If you have a book, right, like you have a job after your PhD, you get a book out, which means that you are able to get tenure in your field, in your department. And sometimes people get their books out within, the first 2 years, 3 years, and then they get tenure. And if, sometimes they are really dissatisfied with their jobs, the department is hostile. And I think, for those who might be international scholars or, which is international scholars coming to the US, your department should pay for your green card. I hope there's another, workshop on that, because that's another whole beast that needs to be confronted about, how to go. And sometimes departments exploit people. I've heard of people paying out of their pockets, which is ridiculous. But so so they get their green card, they get tenure, and then they're really stuck in their jobs. The opportunities for changing your jobs are that much fewer if you have tenure, because once you have tenure, your status changes from assistant professor to associate professor. And the job opportunities for associate professor are a lot fewer. I would say a small percentage of what we have for assistant professors. So if you are not happy in your department and you are like, you need that salary, so you are just working in the department while you're on the job market, it is best to delay the process of publishing your book. You can have an article out, right? So that allows you to stay in the race, so to say, so that you get, when you get a merit review, you can get a raise and all of that, but you don't have a book out. Once you find another job that you're happy with, you release you talk to that department, your new job, and negotiate, okay, by when can I have my book out in order to become an associate professor. And I think that's the best way to go. So sometimes just immediately releasing a book after you have a job is actually not a very, for lack of a better word, a smart choice. So it's better if you're looking for another job, if you are looking to move to another country, it's better to stay as tenure track, even though that comes with its own anxieties, as Wendy was talking about. That's what I was saying.
Do you have a follow-up question? Please go ahead.
I do actually. I'm so sorry for taking up all the time. But so you're saying that tenure track does provide us the mobility to just travel across the countries and be in the tenure track position? Is that what you're?
What I'm saying is that if you are tenure track, so you're assistant professor, you can find other tenure track positions that much more easily than if you're an associate prof, because there are very few, because associate profs get paid at a higher cost. Usually departments prefer, and also associate profs have to do a lot of service work, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's a different process. But if you are not happy with your job or you're looking for a better job opportunity, it's better to publish articles in good journals that can get your name out there. The public facing scholarship that Wendy talked about a lot in the beginning, those
Mm-hmm.
are the ways in which you can get your name out, and so that people consider you for those other excellent job opportunities in tenure track. And then you publish your book once you are at a job where you're like, okay, I'm going to stay here for 10 years or 15 years or whatever your plan is.
Okay, makes sense. All right. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Wendy, do you want to respond to the second part of their question?
About jobs in other places.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, or no, different. Yeah, that one. Okay. Yeah, I don't know of like where the job clearinghouse is for this, but I do know like, a good way to get into kind of like if you're interested in university press publishing. I would say like, you can, so like I was just looking at the UC Press website, like there are sort of like a couple of openings. And I would say like, once you sort of get in there, I think then, there are ways that you can sort of like move around, right? And sort of like get into the position that you want to. The press jobs I know are not that well paid. Um, but they do sort of accommodate people more, with like hybrid meaning like mostly remote work. And then like you might have to travel to a meeting like a couple of times a year, right? That's what they mean by hybrid kind of opportunities. So I would say like that's one way to sort of get your foot in the door. You can also, like if there are any sort of opportunities that are paid opportunities to work on journals that are sort of like all owned, that's owned by a particular press. Like that's like another way that you might be able to kind of like get your foot in the door. There are a couple of like fellowship opportunities for diversifying like the like publishing field. And so that's sort of another thing, but off the top of my head, I can't remember like what those are. But you can look, just search for the keywords like diversifying publishing fellowship, and you should be able to find a couple of those. Those are going to be like really competitive. And so it's a matter of like, do you have the time, right, to like compile that application is the question. But yeah, those exist. And then we
Thank you so
have
much.
another maybe. Of course, of course. And then yeah, maybe one last question from Sana.
Yes, thank you so much. I do appreciate it, Wendy and Shaista. Thank you so much, Shaista, for inviting me and letting me be in this space. I wanted to write this, but then I thought I'm not going to be able to articulate myself correctly. So my sort of conundrum is that as an activist, I have been given this grant to do academic research as part of my activism, and that has been enormously helpful in terms of understanding some of the things that we have been doing as activists in the fields of border abolition in higher education. But it's also really contentious as well because I mean, this is probably a problem that you're facing in North America, both in Canada and in the US, in that a lot of departments are cash strapped. International students aren't necessarily coming or having problems and barriers. And now with Trump being elected in the US, there'll be additional barriers and all of that. And but at the same time, universities do exercise bordering processes. We know this from the Palestine encampments, the last couple of months, and some of the students who are international being targeted and being, effectively deported, in certain cases. My question is this, that I guess going back to my original question is to understand, because I have been approached by some publishers. I did not really give a commitment because I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go. And at the time, I had just gotten the grant and I wanted to do the research and be rigorous because if I'm going to be talking about certain things in these spaces, I want to be able to have a robust argument instead of just saying, well, this is what I think, and then like not having it, I want it to be something that's rigorous, but at the same time, I'm also balancing it with something that is also approachable so that other people, you don't have to be so immersed to,
Sorry,
pick up the
can
book
I,
and read it.
sorry to interrupt. Wendy has to leave in
Yeah.
2 minutes. Can you just pose
Oh,
your
oh, sorry. I apologize. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like in terms of these publishing spaces to understand like where could one go that, I mean, would an academic publisher be better? I'm a little bit confused and I'm still confused. Sorry, I apologize. I don't want to take any more space.
I don't know, Shaista. I don't know how to answer this quickly. But I guess the question is or not the question, but like I was just thinking, like for example, as you were talking about something like Common Notions Press. They publish things that are quite accessible that, and are written, by people who, have like monographs, for example, right? Sort of who are sort of like recognized as being sort of like serious scholars or whatever. Um, and so, and they're also, like extremely committed to um uh, I don't know, like Takpi, for example, right? Like they're sort of like committed to that. So I would say I think you just have to, if um the priority, right, is and sort of it depends on what your line is, right? If it's like I'm not going to publish with a publisher that has not taken a clear stance, right, on boycott, for example, or if like I'm not, or if I'm committed to working with a publisher that is committed to open access or whatever. I think it's really sort of like more about those kinds of things, because in terms of like, whether or not you're qualified or not. Like I mean, yeah, like those are questions that we always like stress about, but are not stressed about by a lot of people who publish it. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Sorry. But it's more, yeah, like what are those sort of like principles that you hold for yourself? And like what are you going to extend to the sort of publishers, right, that you're working with? Like I'm not going to publish with Duke again because I don't think they are ethical publishers, right? Um, for example. Oh, yeah, Common Notions was the press. It's a small press.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I think we can end with this. I know you have another meeting to run off to, but thank you so much for doing this and that too. Like it was 7:30 in California in the morning. So thank you once again. And I just want to say thank you to Bharat for creating this space and to all of you for participating. I don't know, Bharat, if you want to have anything else to add.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy. And thank you, Saista, for first of all, let me recognize this. This is Saista's idea. I just, had some broad ideas, but Saista actually framed it and put in this whole series. So credit goes to Saista and Wendy. Thank you so much for your time, and hope to see you again in our this online platform. And thank you everyone for participating. Bye.